All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. Today we are continuing our discussion of Richard E. Kim's 1964 novel, The Martyred. In our last lecture, we began to talk about some contexts in which I wanted to place the novel: biographical and historical, and finally philosophical. So we talked about the life of the author Richard E. Kim, who came to the U.S. in 1955 after having fought in the Korean War on the side of the South, on the side of the anti-communist forces, and received an education in the United States, including at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. We then talked about the cultural Cold War and its effect on literature, the way in which the CIA and other Western intelligence organizations were secretly funding certain developments, particularly in the arts and humanities, to ward off communism, to fight a cultural front in a war against communism. And so one of the things they did was they contributed money to the Iowa Writers' Workshop specifically to recruit Latin American and African and Asian authors to come to the U.S. and write works that would be works of literary merit, but that would also have a bias against communism and hope to influence the global South to take a stand against communism. And Richard E. Kim was probably at the Iowa Writers' Workshop under those auspices. Whether that was fully known to him or not, it's not clear, though the fact that the novel he probably began writing when he was there, i.e. The Martyred, is about cultural propaganda in a war setting, is at least ironic, if it's not a kind of knowing reflection on his own role in the cultural Cold War. And then finally, I wanted to discuss the novel in a context it invites, which is that of the philosophy of existentialism, particularly that of Albert Camus. And we talked about how existentialism is the belief that there is no pre-given meaning for human beings, that we cannot access any kind of transcendental values that would tell us how to live, and so we must create our own values in order to live authentic lives. And then we discussed how Albert Camus adds to that a political reflection, which is that for Camus, and by the way, I don't think I mentioned this in the last lecture, existentialism had many different political actors and political ideologues among its devotees. So, for instance, one of the initial existentialist philosophers, Martin Heidegger, was notoriously aligned with the Nazi Party in the 1930s. He was a German thinker. Whereas a very famous French existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, Sartre, was aligned with Marxism and with communism and with the left. Albert Camus is pretty much best known politically for refusing to align himself with the extreme left or the extreme right, and praising a kind of moderation, a kind of moderate liberalism, if you will, though with certain anarchist characteristics. It's complicated, but that's how I would position him politically. And in his book, The Rebel, which I argue is the book that most influences The Martyred, he reflects on why the quest for freedom, the quest for social justice, often turns in his view to a totalitarian state, as happened most famously with the Soviet Union. And he stresses at the end of that book that the way to avoid this is not to give up a quest for justice. It's not that he believed that, it's that he believed that in struggling for freedom, in struggling for justice, in rebelling, you have to remember not to think you're God, not to play God, not to usurp the position of God. So those were three contexts: biographical, historical, philosophical, in which I wanted to place The Martyred. And I want to end this introduction to the book, before we get into some of the specifics of the text, by placing it in a literary context. I want to think about the genres, the literary genres that this novel occupies. And the first one I would say is realism. So realism is another one of those isms, but unlike modernism, so modernism really was new in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Excuse me. Modernism was a new development, a new phenomenon, a new way of conceiving literature and the arts. Realism actually is older than modernism. Realism is something that's seen to arise in fiction in particularly Europe and then the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, so the 17 and 1800s. And it is a fiction that represents life as it is, that represents everyday life and common people. So, not particularly the elite of society. You can think of it as being contrasted with, if you've studied, for instance, the works of William Shakespeare. His works are always about the elite of society, and if he brings on common everyday people, they're usually in a subplot and they serve as comic relief. Whereas his main plots are usually about people from elite families like Romeo and Juliet, or are about royal figures like Prince Hamlet or King Lear. But the realist novel, which arises about 150 years after Shakespeare, with the growth of the middle classes in Europe, strives to represent life as it is among common people. So it's opposed to the elitism of prior forms of literature. It's also opposed to the idealism of romantic art. So there was a romantic movement in the 20th century that tended to represent people and settings as enchanted or idealistic. And realism says, no, don't do that. Show people as they are and show life as it is. So realism often has a connotation of being very gritty fiction about, common life, everyday life, the seamy side of life, the parts of life that would be edited out of an idealistic representation. Then, so modernism comes along in the 19th and late 19th and early 20th century, and modernism isn't opposed to realism in the sense that modernism still tends to represent everyday life among common people, but modernism is much more focused on language and society, or on language, language and psychology. So while Quicksand by Nella Larsen is a realist novel, it departs from prior forms of realism by being so intensely focused on what's going on in Helga Crane's mind, almost to the exclusion of anything else in the book. Whereas prior forms of realism tended to take a wider canvas, discuss a broader number of characters, and focus more on externals, on what's going on outside the character's mind, on kind of a broader view of society. And similarly, we didn't read modernist novels that were focused on language, but for instance, we read a poem by Gertrude Stein, which was Susie Asado. And Susie Asado as a poem was almost impossible to understand because it was so focused on being a linguistic experiment. Well, Gertrude Stein also wrote fiction, and her fiction is very similar to that. Her fiction reads almost like something like Susie Asado in prose. So modernism takes the subject matter of realism, everyday life as it is lived, but pushes it into a focus on language and psychology. Now, what happens after World War II, I would argue, is that there's a revival of realism in American literature, but also in world literature. And I think that has to do with the shocks of the political events of World War II and then the Cold War. Writers begin to think, okay, we need to get outside the mind a little bit and take a broader look at society because we're undergoing such calamitous social changes. And then also it has a lot to do with, I think, the decolonization movements across the formerly colonized world in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Because literary theorists have long posited that the realist novel has a relationship to the nation. That when the realist novel was first being born in Europe in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this was the time when European countries were coming into their own as nation states, as sort of united countries focused on a particular people with a shared history and a shared reality. Now, what's happening when the empires of, for instance, Britain and France are crumbling, or in the case of this book, Japan, when these empires are crumbling and formerly colonized countries, whether whether we're talking about countries colonized by the British or the French or the Japanese, are receiving their independence as nations and coming into their own as nations, well, suddenly the realist novel arises as an important literary form in these newly liberated nations in the middle of the 20th century. Now, why, you might ask, why does the realist novel create a sense of national reality? Well, because let's just say you live in a nation, but you live in, say, a small town. Well, how are you going to find out? This is before the internet, mind you, and before even broadcast media like television became prominent. How are you going to find out what's happening in the rest of the country if you live in a small town? Well, the famous scholar who came up with this idea of nations as kind of imagined communities, his name was Benedict Anderson. He said the two big forms were the newspaper and the realist novel, because the newspaper and the realist novel would tell you, one in non-fictional form and one in fictional form, what was happening in other parts of the country, and that gave you a sense that you were living in a shared reality with your fellow citizens of whatever country, whether England or Korea or whatever. You would have a sense, even if you lived in a small town and you didn't ever travel 200 miles away, you would know what was happening 200 miles away in your country. So the realist novel emerges with the nation. And I think that the Martyred is a really good example of that, because, again, while I said it's a novel written in the United States, written in English, and published in the United States, it's also, in a sense, a Korean novel, and a novel of the Korean nation. So, realism. The next literary context in which I'd like to place The Martyred is that of the novel of ideas. So, this is a variant of the realist novel that emphasizes philosophical, religious, or political disputation among its characters. So, this is a novel in which each of the main characters seems to stand for some ideological position and argues for that ideological position with other characters. So when you're reading the novel, you're reading a kind of philosophical, political, or religious, or all three, debate. And I think the most famous author who did the novel of ideas, who is named on the back cover of the Penguin Classics edition of The Martyred as a point of comparison for Richard E. Kim, is the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wrote, especially in his novel The Brothers Karamazov, realist novels that were novels of ideas. So The Brothers Karamazov is about as the title indicates, a group of brothers, each of whom represents a different orientation toward religion and spirituality. So one character is a devout kind of monk. Another character is what's called a sensualist. He just lives for pleasure and never gives any thought to spirituality. Another brother is a tormented atheist who doesn't believe in God but wants to believe in God. And the novel is full of their arguments with one another, where they debate these positions. It's about other things too, but that is how the themes are born through the novel, through the debates of the characters. Albert Camus is another example. His novel The Plague, which is about a town dealing with as the title indicates, a plague, and the different characters' responses to this event and what it makes them think about politics and religion, and they debate with each other. And I think The Martyred was very consciously modeled on the Brothers Karamazov and The Plague. I think Kim was consciously writing in that tradition of the novel of ideas. So, and that will influence how I want to discuss The Martyred, because I do think that each of the characters seems to stand for a different ideological position. And I'm using the word ideology, by the way, in its kind of common sense, its common meaning, where it means a system of ideas to which a person might be subscribed. So I'm arguing that each of the characters is subscribed to a particular system of ideas. There's another definition of this word ideology within Marxism, where um, it means essentially the way that an unequal society justifies itself, the lies it tells to maintain its inequality. That's what ideology means in the Marxist system. But this is not a Marxist novel. In fact, it's an anti-Marxist novel. So I'm going to use it in the sense of a system of ideas to which you're consciously subscribed. Oh, and by the way, if you don't want to read if you don't like reading an anti-communist and an anti-Marxist novel, don't worry. We will be encountering, particularly among the poets of the 1960s, we will be encountering some Marxist and communist writers in this course as well. So this course too will be a kind of debate among ideas. But for now, we are dealing with this anti-communist text. So let's move on then. I want to take a broad view, just as I did with Quicksand. I want to take a broad view of the literary style and techniques used in this novel. How is it written? And I think how it's written has to do with both its themes and its context. So let's just run down kind of a list of the narrative styles and techniques that are used. First of all, it is written in the first person. So we had Quicksand, which was written in the third person, but it was the third person, what I called limited perspective. So it was third person, but we were always in the mind of Helga Crane. And the reason I think Nella Larson chose that style is because she wanted to explore a character who was really interesting because she had a lot of unconscious motivations that she wasn't always aware of. Helga Crane, that is. And I think Nella Larson chose the third person perspective because if Helga had narrated that book, she wouldn't have been able to tell us about her unconscious motivations. Whereas in a third person perspective that hews very closely to her consciousness, Nella Larson is able to expose those unconscious motivations. In this case, we have a first-person narrative from the, I sort of want to say the central character, but Captain Lee is the viewpoint character, but is he the main character? I don't know. I think there are a lot of characters in this book. It's really an ensemble piece. It's really a book about a multitude of characters, but he gives the viewpoint. Mainly, I think, because, as we'll discuss, his characterization, he seems to be the character most committed to the idea of telling the truth, no matter what happens. And whereas other characters each have their reasons for not telling the truth. They think that they can lie in a good cause. And Captain Lee says multiple times in this book that he doesn't think that. And so I think that makes him an ideal narrator. There are novels with first-person narrators who are unreliable, and there are even poems like this. We talked about the dramatic monologue, a poem whose character is a speaker distinct from the author. And we're going to see poems that have a kind of unreliable speaker later in the semester. So you can have a novel or a poem with an unreliable narrator, and in that case, the author signals to you that the narrator is not to be trusted. But I think this is the opposite. I think Kim signals to us multiple times in the book that he is trustworthy. However, there are moments in the book where he's a little bit like Helga Crane, where he says things and does things, and he says, I don't know why I did that, or my reaction shocked me, or my anger surprised me, but he doesn't elaborate. He doesn't introspect. You have to read between the lines. I think this happens a lot in his dealings with the Reverend Shin, because one of the things that Captain Lee seems to have is he thinks he's not a spiritual or religious person, but he seems to have these unacknowledged spiritual longings. But there's no introspection in this book. He sometimes says, I don't know why I said that, but he leaves it at that, and we just have to think about it. So that leads us into the actual prose style. The style of this novel, again, because we only read two books so far, so I have to compare them to get you to see the differences. So we read Quicksand. Quicksand had a fairly elaborate style. It was a novel of very long sentences and very elaborate diction, which is to say word choice. We remember the impecunious Sybarites, and you have to look up both of those words, because it's set in a world. Not It's set in many worlds, but one of the worlds it's set in is a kind of high society where people speak like that and have to talk around subjects. But the Martyred is written in a very simple and direct style, especially the diction, which again is the word choice. We are not given a very literary style. There's not a lot of long words you have to look up. It's written almost like journalism or like history. It's very simple. And this was a style that was pretty common in mid 20th century American and world writing. Camus was described as having a degree zero style. His prose was so simple that it was frozen. And another famous American writer of this period or just before this period was Ernest Hemingway, who wrote in the same way. And so Kim writes in this mid 20th century style of very simple and direct prose with an emphasis on gloomy, bleak, and grim imagery, which we'll look at, and terse dialogue. That leads us to the narrative style. The narrative style, though we have a first person narrator, is very impersonal. And what I mean is it doesn't introspect. There's not a lot of reflections on the inner life as there were in Quicksand. And I think that impersonality is a characteristic of mid century culture. So, what does it consist of if it doesn't consist of the endless passages of introspection that we saw in Quicksand? Well, this book gives us endless passages of external description followed by dialogue. And in that way, that leads me to the question of technique. This book reminds me very much of a play or of a movie. It almost feels like a screenplay. Every chapter sort of begins with, here's where we are, here's the setting, here's a few words about the setting, and then the characters present in that setting launch into a conversation, just the way a play or a movie is written. And if you focus on it as a movie, I think we get something that's also characteristic. I have not emphasized this yet, or I haven't emphasized this, and I won't going forward, but let me say it now. Another characteristic of mid 20th century literature is mid 20th century literature is being written in a moment where cinema has emerged, and cinema has challenged the primacy of the novel as the main form of kind of representation and entertainment. So the idea of the novel as the thing that unites the nation was very, very true in the 19th century, and even I think true in the early 20th century. But as movies and cinema and other forms of recorded media become more prominent, they start to supplant the novel. And Kim, I think, is writing in the middle or at the beginning of that change. And one of the characteristics of mid 20th century novels is that they often read like screenplays, they often read like movies. And I think you can see writers responding to the challenge of cinema in that way. So those are the literary styles and techniques at work in The Martyred. Now I want to talk about the plot, because you'll remember I didn't summarize the plot very much when we read Quicksand, because I thought the plot was very straightforward. We just sort of followed Helga through a variety of social settings and relationships, and there wasn't much, the mystery was why Helga did what she did. But what she did was clear. We didn't have to, dwell on the plot at length. But this book has a bit of a twisty, suspenseful plot. And I think I even want to hint that there's even a third genre we could put it in that wasn't present on my slide about genres, which is this is a spy novel. It's a kind of thriller. It's what I would call an intellectual thriller, because we have a main character who works in espionage in a war setting. We could also call it a war novel. It occupies a number of genres. And one of the characteristics of the spy novel, or even the spy movie, spy fiction, is that it's in a world of espionage, people aren't what they seem, right? Because they are, a spy is by definition, either undercover in an organization and pretending to be on a different side, or is using something as propaganda. So this is a book that's concerned with espionage and concerned with propaganda, and things were not what they seem. Just as Richard Kim, on a scholarship in Iowa that was actually, laundered CIA money. That wasn't what it seemed either. So the spy world brings us in to this kind of weird hall of mirrors or maze of meaning. And so that makes the plot much more complicated than the story of Quicksand, which was the story of an ordinary person who was not engaged in these kinds of activities. So I am actually going to summarize the plot a little bit in case you're confused, because I think it can be confusing, especially there's a paradox about this book, which is that the directness of the style is weirdly confusing because the author doesn't elaborate on a lot of things, and so you have to read between the lines. It's a deceptive simplicity. Everything about this book is deceptive. It's a deceptive simplicity. It seems simple, but then you're like, wait, why did he do that? Why did he say that? So we need to think about the plot. So here's the basic plot. Early in the Korean War, Captain Lee, a former university instructor and current intelligence, I said author there. I didn't mean author. I meant current intelligence officer. I was thinking about Richard E. Kim. A current intelligence officer. Intelligence author is a good title there. Sorry, I shouldn't digress on recorded lectures. A current intelligence officer is assigned to the northern city of Pyongyang after its capture from the communists. So remember, the Korean War is a fight between the communists in the north and the liberal Democrats, or whatever you want to call them, in the south, over who will control the Korean peninsula. And what happens in this early moment in the war is the southern anti-communist forces have advanced into the north and captured the main northern city. And what eventually, this is not a spoiler of the novel because this is just history, what eventually is going to happen is the north will strike back and advance, and they will even go down and start capturing southern cities, and eventually the war ends in a stalemate with a division between a communist north and a non-communist south. But at this point early in the novel, the south is winning. They've captured the northern city, and Captain Lee has been assigned to Pyongyang. Now, his superior officer, Colonel Chang, who's also an intelligence officer, so they're again involved in espionage, propaganda, everything to do with the, what you might call the intellectual and propagandistic side of the war, he assigns Lee to the case of 12 Christian ministers who have been murdered by communists during the occupation of Pyongyang. So again, the southern forces get to Pyongyang and they discover that when the communists controlled the city, they murdered 12 Christian ministers. Why did they do that? Well, we'll see specifics, but basically communism and Marxism more generally was a militantly atheist ideology. It wanted to extirpate, it wanted to destroy Christianity and other forms of religion because it saw them as, well, forms of ideology, as lies, unequal cultures told, you're poor now, but if you be good, you'll go to heaven, and that pacified the poor. That was a Marxist theory of how religion worked as a kind of pacification of an unequal society. So they wanted to destroy religion. And then a more cynical take would be that they themselves, the communists, as bearers of a totalizing ideology, an ideology that offered a total explanation of the world and society and life, did not want to coexist with any rivals who offered a different total explanation, which of course Christianity does. So they were anti-Christian. So they killed these communists, the communists killed these 12 Christian ministers. And Colonel Chang wants to use this event as anti-communist propaganda. He wants to say to other Christians in Korea and to Christians across the world, look at how awful the communists are, look at how much they hate Christianity. This shows how we need to fight them. However, there's a problem with using this as propaganda, because 12 ministers were captured, but 14 ministers were captured, but 12 were executed. And 2 ministers have survived, the Reverend Shin and Han. Now, why did they survive? Colonel Chang wants Captain Lee to look into this. Did they betray their fellow ministers? Did they survive because they said to the communists, hey, we'll work with you, we'll collaborate with you, we'll sell these other guys out, just don't kill us? Because if that happened, then their survival is a liability. Their survival makes Christianity look bad, because here you have these 2 ministers that sold out their fellow Christians. And so if they did that, that's a problem. Reverend Shin is not forthcoming. He says, it was divine intervention. He won't explain what happened. And the fact that he won't explain what happened, or at least in intelligible secular terms, makes him look bad, because it means it might mean he has something to hide. So this is a problem for the effort to use this event as propaganda. So there's another complication for Captain Lee, which is that one of the ministers who was executed was the estranged father of Lee's best friend, Lieutenant Park. So Lieutenant Park was Captain Lee's friend in the university, and they became fellow university instructors together, and they were secular people. And not only that, they weren't just secular. Lieutenant Park was a militant atheist, and this led him into a conflict with his father, who seems to have been a very, maybe even almost fanatical Christian. And so you have this fanatical Christian and this fanatical atheist who are father and son, and they lock horns, butt heads, whatever metaphor you want. And so this leads to their estrangement, and Captain Lee finds out that his best friend's father has been murdered. And so he knows that he needs to tell him this. So eventually he asks, he asks Lieutenant Park to come to where he is. And Park is not interested in the propaganda effort, because he doesn't care about Christianity. He's against Christianity. He's against communism and Christianity. He doesn't want all this propaganda around his father. But what he does want to know is, did his father experience doubt before his death? Because if his father experienced doubt before his death, then it means they had something in common. It means they had something they could share. But if his father didn't, then they remain estranged even in death. So there's this personal story that's connected. There's these big world historical, political, and religious things happening, but it's also happening in people's everyday lives. And I think that's a big theme of mid-century literature, of Cold War literature, of the way these big political events invade people's personal lives. All right, just a few more moments. I'm summarizing, by the way, the first half of the novel now. I will summarize the second half of the novel in the next lecture. So there's yet another character we need to talk about, who is Chaplain Co. Chaplain Co is a minister who was also a spy in North Korea when it was occupied. And he was spying for the South. And he takes an interest in the case of Reverend Shin and the 12 murdered or martyred ministers, because he had an experience that sort of speaks to their experience, which is when he was a minister in North Korea, he was a spy, and he had some fellow spies working under him in the church, but one of them was an informer for the communists. So this is, again, one of the ways the spy novel works. People are not what they seem. And when his superior officers, including Colonel Chang, found out that he had an informer in the group, which means that they were going to be given up to the communists and possibly killed, Colonel Chang sent people in there to pull Chaplain Co out, to pull him out of that location because his life was in danger. He knew who the informer was, though, and so he wanted to take the other spies with him who were not his informers, but he didn't get a chance to get them out, and they were all captured by the communists, and the communists didn't even wait to figure out which one of the three was actually their informer, and they shot all three. So he has, number one, he has that on his conscience. Another thing he has on his conscience is that because he was a spy, his congregation didn't know that he was spying. He was undercover. So they think he just ran away. They think he was a coward. And they think he abandoned those other guys who got killed. And then there's a third complication, which is the guy who was the informer who got killed was actually the son of one of the elders of the church, but the elder and the other congregants didn't know he was an informer. So they think he was a hero and Chaplain Co was just a scumbag, a traitor, a coward, a guy who fled and left these other guys to be killed. So he has all these things weighing on his conscience. And that's the reason he takes the interest in Shin, because he wants to know, well, did Shin break under, the torture of the communists and sell out his fellows? Or did he have a good reason that people don't know about, just as Chaplain Co did? So that's the thing he's coming into this with. All right, the next plot development is that once Colonel Chang broadcasts the fact of the massacre, he has it published in a kind of newspaper, Shin is attacked by angry Christians who think he betrayed the murdered ministers. Because remember, all they know is 14 people were captured, 2 people got away. Why did the 2 people get away? They must have sold out the other guys. So the other Christians are angry at Colonel Chang. They think he betrayed Christianity and his fellow Christians. So Chaplain Co takes him out of the city. Chaplain Co takes him away. Because remember, Shin is also sick. Shin has what appears to be tuberculosis. And the other minister who escaped, Reverend Han, appears to be pretty severely mentally ill. He appears to not be in his right mind. And so both of them are vulnerable people. And so, there's a concern that if they're attacked, it could be a bad thing. So Chaplain Co takes them from the city. And then the development that happens right in the middle of the book is that a communist prisoner confesses under torture that the ministers were murdered by drunken communists who were supposed to be holding them as hostages, but just they got drunk and started sort of torturing and abusing their prisoners. So this adds to the horror of that situation. But the prisoner also reveals that many of the ministers broke down and pled for their lives. Most of them did. And so this, if that were exposed, that would ruin their image as martyrs. That would ruin their images as perfect victims, because they broke under torture. They didn't face up to the strain. They didn't comport themselves as holy men. They just pled for their lives. So this is a problem for Colonel Chang. However, one thing we do learn from the prisoner is that Park's father did not break down. So you remember that Park was concerned with, did his father have a moment of doubt, a moment of humanity? Well, the answer is no. He held to his faith to the last, but was killed anyway. But we also learn from that captured prisoner that Shin fought back. In fact, the reason Shin was spared is not because he broke down and collaborated. It's because he fought back and fought against his communist captors. So he was not only not a coward, he was probably one of the most heroic of the ministers. Now, why then won't he say this? Why won't he say, hey, I fought back, I wasn't a coward, I'm a true Christian hero? Because if he said that, then that would be as good as implying that the other 12 ministers were the ones who were cowards. And that would tarnish the image of Christianity. That would make them look bad. So he's essentially, you'll note there's biblical imagery here under the surface, right? He's taking the sins of his fellow ministers onto himself. He's kind of a Christ-like figure, suffering for others, taking the sins of others onto himself and acting in that way as a kind of sacrifice for the good of humanity. And then the other symbolism there is 12, they're like the 12 executed ministers are like the 12 apostles, essentially. So there's this undercurrent of biblical symbolism running throughout the text, and Shin appears as this Christ figure However, um, Jesus in the Bible does not lie. Jesus in the Bible does not tell a lie. So there's something in this book that's more morally compromising. Shin is morally compromised. He has to tell a lie to take on these sins. Okay, so this is and the question is, does this compromise his religion? I think one of the major questions of this book is the following: is it okay to lie, not just interpersonally, but to broadcast lies? Is it okay to tell lies politically, for a good cause, and whether that's a good religious cause or a good political cause? And if you do that, do you become no better than the people you're fighting against? Do you morally compromise yourself in a way that makes you morally equivalent to the people you're fighting against? And that's a question that the novel continues to ask. Are the Christians, are the liberal forces no better than the communists because of what they're doing? Not just lying, but, for instance, torture. And we'll have to explore that. The next thing I want to look at is the setting of the novel. I think the setting, it's a book, as I said, that most of it is dialogue. Most of it really is a discussion among the characters of these issues. But that dialogue is very carefully and very deliberately situated in a setting, which is, yes, Pyongyang, but also the setting of a bombed out city, a post-war city, a city that's in ruins, a city whose religious institutions are in ruins. And so we want to look at some of the ways that this is described. So, for instance, I want to focus on this idea of the nearly demolished church and the bell, which is described on the 3rd page of the book. So across the street from the office where Chang and Lee are working, across the street the church bell clanged. I opened the window. From the white-blue November sky of North Korea, a cold gust swept down the debris-ridden slope, whipping up here and there dazzling snow flurries, smashing against the ugly bullet-riddled buildings of Pyongyang. People who had been digging in the ruins of their homes stopped working. They straightened up and looked toward the top of the slope at the remains of the nearly demolished central church, and then at the gray carcass of a cross-topped bell tower where the bell was clanging. They gazed at one another as though they understood the esoteric message of the bell. So esoteric means secret. Now, this ruined church with a bell that clangs is a motif that is a repeating image throughout the novel. So just look, 50 pages after this, Chang, or I think it's Lee, Lee here says, I wished for the first time since the war that I was back at my university. Outside the window, the gray morning hung low, blurring the city. In the sky, dirty clouds flew over the church. The bell clanged faintly. If you pay attention to this book, maybe if you read it twice, you'll see that the bell is mentioned every 10 pages, every 5 pages. So what is the church bell? I would argue that we have a setting with a symbolic element. It's a very bleak setting. It's a ruined setting. Even the weather, it's cold, it's snowy, it's frozen. We're in this very bleak setting, and yet there's this nearly demolished church and a faint church bell. And I would say that is symbolic for the kind of barely still there promise of transcendence. Yes, the mid-20th century is full of horrors. It's violent, it's brutal, it's paranoid. There's been World War II, there's been the Cold War, there's the Korean War, and yet there's this church bell just faintly sounding. And that's like the distant promise of some spiritual salvation. Is this novel going to ultimately, will this be a Christian novel as well as an anti-communist novel? We'll have to wait till the end to know that. But this bell gives us the faint promise that there might be this spiritual redemption somewhere in the world. And I think that continues again on page 19. You hear the clanging of the bell too. And so this idea of the bell as a motif, the ruined church as a motif. Another motif is So, Reverend Shin's house, I don't have the passage here, but the first time we hear about Reverend Shin's house, we hear it's a lonely house at the top of a hill. Then there's a scene where Lee and Chang go to Shin's church, and we hear that it's at the top of a hill, and it's very hard to get there because there's ice and you have to climb this icy hill. And then when you get there, it's a towering church of red brick with marble pillars, the cross-topped belfry perched high above the blinding snow on the roof, its many bells ringing, vibrating in the sunny air. So here we have a church that's intact, and we're going to find out why it's intact. I want to discuss that later. But we have a church that's intact, but it's at the top of this hill that's hard to get to. And the main minister who preaches there, his own house is at the top of a hill. And so we have these lonely religious buildings that are hard to reach. So whatever faith might be available, again, I'm speaking symbolically now, whatever faith might be available in the modern world, it's transcendent. It's overlooking the city. It's overlooking the country. It's high up, as you know, as is appropriate for religious faith, and it's hard to get to, and it's lonely when you get there. So faith, it might be possible, but it's difficult. So you can contrast that. We don't know yet if this is a Christian novel, but I don't think it's going to be an anti-Christian novel. And we read Quicksand by Nella Larson. That was an anti-Christian, anti-religious book. That took a very hard line, almost a Marxist line on Christianity, that it was just a kind of pacification for the poor. This book takes a different perspective. I think this book respects religious faith. So that's the way, one of the ways in which you can see, when you take a course in literature, you could put the different works in conversation with each other. So we have a much more religiously affirmative book here, but one that nevertheless says, the way is hard. The way is hard, and it's not clear that it's going to be able to help the ruined mid-20th century world. All right, so with that in mind, the difficulty of faith, what are the problems that are ruining the mid-century world? Well, in this book there are a couple, and we'll discuss some of them later, particularly espionage, propaganda, and paranoia. But also this book focuses on the horror of war, and particularly the horror of civil war, of internecine war. So there's a moment in the book where Park sends Lee a letter about his experiences fighting in the war. And he says, it was a pitch black night. We all spoke Korean. Devil only knew which side we were killing. Everyone was shouting in the same language, "Who are you? Who are you?" For a while, the bewilderment, the confusion, was simply staggering. Then something, panic, terror, you name it, snapped, and everyone was killing everyone else. And he ends his letter by saying, "Perhaps I am frightened of myself. I am the very source of my horror." So first of all, war is horrible. It's violent, it's bloody, people fight, people die. But this book emphasizes the particular horror of a civil war. Because while the Korean War is a proxy battle between the Western and Eastern blocs in the Cold War, it's also a civil war. It's a war between people who share a history, who share an ethnicity, who share a language. And so the horror of a civil war is you're killing people who look like you, speak the same language as you, and that, I think, is its own special form of trauma, its own particular form of trauma that this novel emphasizes. And it also adds to the whole problem of the issue of spying and the issue of espionage. You can't trust other people. If it were a war between two different countries where the people spoke different languages and maybe they practiced different religions, maybe they're of different ethnicities, you would know who the enemy was. But a civil war means somebody looks like you, shares your culture, shares your language, could be working for the other side. And that lends to the air of paranoia. It also emphasizes again the horror of the violence. So we get Captain Lee's flashback to the moment where there were prisoners who had been killed inside a cave, and he was present for the excavation of these corpses in the cave, and how there were cameras there and they were taking photos. And again, why were they taking photos? Well, among other things, it would be anti-communist propaganda. Look what these communists did. And while Lee is on the anti-communist side, he wants to shield the victim that he's just pulled out of the cave. It's a dead body, so it's not like he's preserving this person's privacy and life, but he wants to preserve the dignity of this body. A terrible shame seized me, and I crouched over the man. I wanted to shield with my body the mute dignity of his suffering from the nonchalant, prying eyes behind the camera. And so much of this book is, can you maintain your secrets? Can you maintain a private life? Can you maintain your dignity when everything becomes fodder for this political mission of the Cold War, of communism versus liberalism? Similarly, again and again, the setting is described as sort of horrifically martial, that is, military. So the snow was getting heavier, the sky darker. Through the window I saw columns of medium tanks, their guns prostrate, crawl past the ruins, trailed by another column of howitzers, which are a kind of artillery, northbound. The snow soon covered the tracks left by the heavy treads. Silence returned to the streets, and with it the brooding afternoon of a dreary northern city. So this bleak, moody military setting. And then similarly, this novel's style of very simple prose makes it very understated. And an understated style works by, there are enormities being said in very simple, seemingly emotionally flat sentences. So when Park arrives in Pyongyang, he says, "All I want now is to take a look at whatever is left of my hometown." And that's a very simple statement. It's not said with any emotion, but it's very emotional. My hometown is ruined. My hometown is gone. So this novel and Kim's style works to make you feel the emotion all the more by withholding it. The characters don't emote, so you have to intuit what they're feeling, what emotions they're experiencing behind that. And I think that's similar. Just think of Anthony Hecht's poem, More Light, More Light. It worked in a very similar way, a very understated style describing horrors and atrocities. And I think part of the idea, I think there's an ethical dimension here, which is it's kind of, the horrors are so horrific that if a writer tried to compete with them by becoming very emotional, it would almost be indecent. It would almost be undignified. The way the writer allows the victims of these very real atrocities to preserve their dignity is to just say what happened and let people feel what is natural to feel, not to try to turn the attention to yourself as a writer by making it an occasion for verbal hysterics. I think that's the idea of using an understated style when writing about this kind of subject matter. And I think Kim does that. I think Hecht does that. I think Hayden does that in Middle Passage. And I think some of the authors that have inspired Kim, like Hemingway and Camus, choose the same technique. All right, now we need to begin to explore the characters. As I said, this is a novel of ideas, and in a novel of ideas, the characters stand for different kind of ideological positions or orientations. So I want to go through each of the main characters and pull out some passages to support the idea that each of them sort of represent or are almost symbolic for or symbolic of a kind of ideological orientation. So let's start with our main character, Captain Lee. Captain Lee, one thing we know about him is he's not religious. So one of the questions of this novel is, what religion do the characters practice? What religion do they adhere to? He is not religious. So Shin asks him very early in the book, he says, "You don't believe in God, do you?" No. So he doesn't believe in God. He's not religious. However, and this is a passage I want to return to, he does seem to have some religious yearning or religious longing. And we learn that he was raised Christian, by the way. We learn he was sent to a Christian school. So it's not that he's ignorant of Christianity or knows nothing about it. It's just that as an adult, he doesn't subscribe to or practice the faith. But he asks Shin, he says, "Your God, is he aware of the sufferings of his people?" And he even says to Shin something else, which I don't have excerpted on this slide. He says, I think I need you more than you need me. There's some spiritual longing that he has, some openness to religion, though he claims not to be a Christian, he claims not to believe in God. And this comes out in his extreme defensiveness of Reverend Shin. So when Lieutenant Park says something kind of slighting about Shin to him, and he says, "I'm going to go see Shin and find out about my father," Lee kind of explodes. He says, "Leave him alone," I said. It shocked me to hear myself shouting. So what is his investment in this person? Well, I would argue it's this unspoken spiritual yearning. Does God know how we're suffering? Is God aware? I don't believe in God, but does God know how I'm suffering? So that open-mindedness is one element of his character. Another element of his character is his drive for the truth, though. He's very much wary, and we learn, by the way, that he didn't choose to become an intelligence officer. We're told at the beginning of the book. It's not like, oh, all my life I wanted to be a spy. No, what happened was he was a university lecturer. He went to fight in the war, and he got wounded, and he was recovering in the hospital. And it was there that some senior officers realized, oh, you're a very educated person. You shouldn't just be fighting the physical part of the war. You are better suited to be fighting the intellectual part. So they sent him into intelligence. But in many ways, he's clearly not suited for intelligence because he doesn't believe you should lie. He doesn't believe you should lie even in a good cause. And so I have one example on my slide, but there are several examples throughout the book of different characters, Shin and Chang in particular, saying to him, "What would you do if you were in my position?" And he says, "I would just tell the truth." And they're telling him, well, we can't tell the truth because if we tell the truth, it's going to mess up the war effort, So he says, I don't care. I would tell the truth. So we have an open-minded person who wants to tell the truth. So the phrase I've applied to him, which I borrowed from another writer I've never even mentioned in this course, who also wrote novels of ideas in a very spare style. His name is J.M. Coetzee. He is a South African writer, Coetzee. And he often wrote about characters who were men of liberal conscience. And what I mean by the word liberal there is not really like the ideological meaning. I just mean liberal in the sense of concerned with the rights of the individual, wary of totalitarian ideologies, and concerned with the truth. And one of the things that supposedly separated the liberal capitalist side from the communist side in the Cold War is people in the West, people in America, said the communists, they are a totalitarian society that is dominated by a set of lies that they inculcate into the citizenry as an ideology. Well, what happens in this novel? What happens in this novel is that the anti-communist side is lying for propaganda purposes. They're telling lies to the people. What happened outside this novel, though people didn't know this at the time, the CIA was involved in cultural production. So what I mean when I say Lee is the man of liberal conscience is he's kind of the liberal conscience of the liberal side of the war. He's the one saying, hey, the point here is not to be totalitarian. The point here is not to be propagandistic. It's not to lie. He's trying to keep his own side from becoming what he knows they accuse, rightly enough, the other side of. It's not, the point is that the communists were good. The point is, yes, the communists weren't good, but how do you prevent the other side from becoming just as bad? And he, with his open-mindedness and his drive for truth, is the liberal conscience of the novel, at least in its first half. We'll have to see what develops in the second half. All right, so if Captain Lee is the man of liberal conscience, what are some of the other characters? Well, Colonel Chang is the realist pragmatist, I would say, at least in the first half. He doesn't seem to be Christian. He resents Christianity. He's even described as looking like a Buddhist monk, which I take to be an allusion to the idea that Christianity in Korea and in perhaps East Asian countries more generally is kind of a latecomer as a religion. It's a religion that came from points further west and might be in its own way kind of an occupying force. And so he's described in the language of a religion that kind of predates the Christian presence in East Asian culture. He's fairly hostile, at least in the first half of the novel, to Christianity, and he's described as being bald with a bulbous nose, who rocks back and forth. He's very kind of given this kind of physical description, this kind of like, he's got a lot of physicality, this kind of bulbousness. So he represents like crude material facts against both, Christianity and communism. But he's a pragmatist. He will do what works. He says, I don't believe in Christianity. I don't care about Christianity, but I'll protect Reverend Shin. I'll make him a hero. I'll even cooperate with him for the cause of Christianity in North Korea, he says. So he says, I'll do whatever it takes. It doesn't matter what I think. He doesn't have Captain, sorry, I'm mixing up everybody's rank. I'm not a military person. He doesn't have Captain Lee's drive for truth at all costs. Captain Lee says, what's the problem? Just tell the truth. Colonel Chang says, no, I'm not telling the truth. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make my side win. And he's very cynical about religion, God, and he says as a preacher, he knows how to put on a good act, theatrical, if you know what I mean. So he assumes religious people are the same as him. They don't really believe anything. They're just putting on a show to control an element of the population. So he's this cynical realist pragmatist who always voices the most cynical interpretation of events, as opposed to Captain Lee, who, while similarly secular, is more open-minded toward religion and drives for the truth. Now we need to look at Mr. Shin himself. I would argue that he is, I call him the Christian saint. And I don't mean literally he's going to be canonized by the church. What I mean is that he is an unworldly figure. He's the exact opposite of Colonel Chang, seemingly, in that he does everything for religion and does not take a cynical attitude toward it. And even the imagery with which he's described, he has tuberculosis, and he's described as having a hollow look with large feverish eyes. So it's as if he's sort of possessed by spiritual forces so much that his very body is fading away. There was an influential book written in about 10 years after this novel, a book called Illness as Metaphor by a famous American cultural critic named Susan Sontag. And Sontag talks about the ways that various diseases have functioned as metaphors, and she talks about tuberculosis in particular. And he's not said to have tuberculosis, but he's sort of coughing blood. He has all the symptoms of tuberculosis. And she says this disease was often associated with people of a very spiritual temperament, because it afflicted people who were young, and it killed people when they were young, and they sort of wasted away. And it was as if they were too good for the world. She said that was the metaphor that attached to tuberculosis. And I think that Kim is drawing on this imagery. And he says, I speak in terms of the truth of my faith. So whatever he says is to be interpreted not in worldly terms, but in spiritual terms. However, there is a complication here, which is that just like Colonel Chang, we do learn that he's telling a lie. He's lying about his own role in the martyrdom of the Christian ministers. But he's doing it not for cynical reasons. He's doing it to protect faith. So he will give everything, his body, his integrity, everything for faith, everything for the truth of metaphysical, unworldly belief. And in that way, even though weirdly he is a liar, he's saintly. He's too good for the world. I would contrast him with Chaplain Co. Chaplain Co. I call the Christian warrior. He will openly fight for the faith. He does not hesitate to join the war effort. He does not hesitate to become a spy. He says, I betrayed my congregation. When a pastor begins to be suspicious of members of his congregation, even of his elders, he is betraying them. But he does it anyway because he will openly fight for his faith. And he says, early in the book, he says, I did what I had to do. I did what I felt was the right thing. I am not in sympathy with the notion of non-violent resistance. I have no intention of turning the other cheek to be slapped twice. Heavens no, I am sorry, but I don't admire those early Christians who calmly, so the story goes, waited, praying to be devoured by the howling beasts of Roman emperors. I am more inclined to worship the God of the Old Testament. I don't mind telling you that most of those 12 martyrs really don't deserve to be called martyrs at all. Why, they didn't lift a finger to resist their persecution. They didn't do anything to alleviate the suffering of the Christians in North Korea. So he says, I know there's this tradition of pacifism in Christianity. Jesus says turn the other cheek. Many Christian and other spiritual figures, he's referring to Gandhi, for instance, who adopted a stance of nonviolent resistance to resist British colonialism. Around the time that Kim is writing this novel, Martin Luther King in the United States adopts a Christian stance of nonviolent resistance to resist racism. So this is a tradition all over the world in Christianity and other faiths. And Co says, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight openly. I will fight for the faith. So he's the Christian warrior. He's not saintly. He doesn't pretend to be more unworldly than he is. He wants to fight for the good of the church and the world. He's protecting the institution of the church rather than faith in an abstract sense, in the way that the saintly Reverend Shin is. One more character, and then I'll end today's lecture. We have Lieutenant Park. Lieutenant Park, I call him the tormented doubter. So he's an atheist, but I would say he's too obsessed with religious questions to just be an atheist. If you just didn't believe in God, you'd just be like, well, whatever, I don't believe in God, I'm just going to go on about my day. No, he's as obsessed with God not existing as his father is obsessed with God existing. He's the type of atheist, I don't know if you've ever met a person like this or read an author like this, but there's a type of atheist who I think of as mad at God because God doesn't exist, if you follow the paradox. I put Lieutenant Park in that category. He is furiously obsessed with the idea that God doesn't exist because obviously he so much wants it to be true. And his conflict with his father is about the way that his father is so sure and he's not sure. And so when he comes back to North Korea, he says, and I'm looking at the passage on the right of the slide, I want to find out how he died. He says, now that he's dead, I'm obsessed with his death. I want to know if he died with his image unshattered. I only want to know if there was anything in the last days of his life that I might share with him. So he wants to know if his father experienced religious doubt the way he does. And if he didn't, then they have nothing in common. So we have Lee, the man of liberal conscience, open-minded. We have Park, the cynical pragmatist and realist. We have the saintly Mr. Shin. We have the spiritual warrior Chaplain Co. And we have the tormented doubter Lieutenant Park. This is all the first half of the novel. So I'm going to end my lecture now, and I'm going to say, please finish reading the novel and see how these ideological and religious disputes among these characters work out. Are these characters the same at the end of the novel as they were at the beginning? how do the events of the novel change their ideological position. I will pick up where I left off and discuss some of the themes of the novel and how they work out in its disputed ideas in the next lecture. So thank you very much for today, and have a great day.